Well, the 25th of April, come and gone. ANZAC Day. Very important day in the Australian calendar. Australian New Zealand Army Corps Day. Well, that's what ANZAC stands for. I'm quite concerned about ANZAC Day. I'm not concerned about the fact that we remember the dead. I think it's important that people remember the dead. And I think it's wrong to denigrate people who've died in combat for a variety of reasons. I've got no problem with people remembering their friends and relatives who've died in war. Many of them are useless exercises. But what concerns me about ANZAC Day is how it has been hijacked over the last 2 or 3 decades by people who are promoting a different agenda. Not an agenda for which ANZAC Day was created, which was to remember those who died in war, but promoting a militaristic and a nationalist agenda and using ANZAC Day to promote these values in the Australian community. I think in order to us to understand how we find ourselves in this situation, what we need to do is actually go back to the roots of ANZAC Day. Well, ANZAC Day comes from the Gallipoli landing in the First World War. And I don't think many people actually understand how divisive the First World War was in Australia and the impact it had on Australian society. When war was declared in August 1914, Prime Minister Fisher, one of the first Labor Prime Ministers in this country, declared that they would support England to the last man and the last shilling. And it's quite interesting that those words came to haunt successive governments during the First World War. The First World War was essentially a trade war, fought for the glory of God, King and country. Now on ANZAC Day you'll hear people talk about liberty, democracy, freedom. Well, the First World War had nothing to do with those important central concepts. And for people to somehow equate the loss and the suffering that occurred as a result of the First World War with the fight for liberty or democracy or freedom is an outright 100% lie. The First World War was essentially a trade war between England and Germany and their assorted allies. And when the Duke of Sarajevo was killed, executed, assassinated by Serbian nationalists, it set off a train of events which saw the beginning of the war. Now in Australia there was great excitement. People wanted to join. They thought it would all be over in a few months. It was quite an exciting time for young men and women of this country. And 420,000 young men volunteered, and the key word is volunteered, to be part of the First World War. 420,000. 62,000 died on the European killing fields in a war fought by workers at either end of a bayonet. Within 10 years of the other 320,000 returning, another 60,000 died of their war wounds. In a population of 5 million, that is an extraordinary number. It's estimated that 1 in 2 families lost somebody during the war. 1 in 2. Now Australia was a divided nation during this period. Although there was almost a universal acceptance of war in August 1914, within a few months an anti-war movement grew up which was spearheaded by the industrial workers of the world, a radical anarchist union which had members in almost every state in the Commonwealth of Australia, but was heavily its most active membership was in New South Wales. Over the next 12 months, as the number of volunteers dried up, as people realised the consequences of volunteering and the fact that people were actually fighting other people's wars that had nothing to do with Australia, the government attempted to introduce conscription. Billy Hughes, the Labor Prime Minister, with 1/3 of his cabinet, crossed the floor and joined the opposition National Party Conservatives. They then went on a campaign to push conscription through federal parliament. Concerned about the trade union movement and the Roman Catholic Church under Archbishop Mannix, who was Irish, virulent campaign against conscription, and concerned about a general strike and concerned about a revolt in Australia, they were forced to hold a plebiscite in December 1916. And the Australian people, in the midst of the World War I, voted not to introduce conscription. There was a second conscription plebiscite in late 1917, and once again the Australian people voted not to introduce conscription. So here we have a society which is torn asunder, divided. The industrial workers of the world, who had spearheaded this campaign against conscription with the women's movement, the Catholic Church and the trade union movement, were banned, their assets were confiscated, and their members were jailed. And in many regards, when you look at the laws which were passed in 1916 and 1917 to deal with industrial workers of the world, they parallel the laws that have been passed in Australia in the last decade to combat terrorism, in inverted commas. So what we are seeing today is not very different to what we saw then. The casualties were extraordinary. 8,000 Australians died in one day, in one battle on the Western Front. Over 20 million people died during the First World War. 80% of the volunteers were not married, or didn't have any relations. These were young men with a future ahead of them. In some families, 2 or 3 or 4 sons died on the killing fields. This had a profound impact on Australian society. And when you travel around Australia, you'll notice in every hamlet, every village, every suburb, every town, a war memorial to the dead. Because when you think about 60,000 dead out of a population of 5 million, and we're talking about within the age group of about 16 to about 40, it has a profound impact on Australian life. And the tragedy is that Australians don't know the truth about the First World War. They've been fed this garbage that it was a war for liberation, a war for humanity, a war to end all wars, a war for democracy, a war for freedom. It had nothing to do with it. Interestingly, it was the votes of the volunteers in France which determined the failure of the first conscription plebiscite in December 1916. Because those soldiers began to understand they were basically cannon fodder in a war that was being fought by workers at either end of the bayonet. Now, ANZAC Day also incorporates other wars. It incorporates the Second World War. The Second World War is a different matter. The Second World War was a war against fascism. It was a war against dictatorship. And there was nothing more clear about the Second World War. And it's interesting that the Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister, refused to heed Churchill's call to keep Australian troops in the Middle East. The troops who fought at Tobruk and Palestine in the Middle East, when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor and then started to bomb northern Australia. And I think a lot of people don't realise how close the Japanese were to invading Australia. Just south of Melbourne, there's currently an excavation in the sea going on regarding a frigate which was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine. There's an old Japanese pilot who flew over Melbourne in 1942, was recounting his experiences where he was looking at the city and nobody actually noticed that there was a Japanese plane in the sky, which is quite interesting. But look, if there is any war that can be justified, it's the World War II. And if there's any military exercise that it can be justified is the campaign by the Australian Chockos, which was a term which the seasoned troops of Tobruk and the Palestine used for the young men, mainly 18, 19 and 20, who were given a few months training and sent up to New Guinea to stop the Japanese forces crossing New Guinea and invading Australia. They were called Chockos because they were supposed to be chocolate soldiers, not real soldiers, and they would actually melt in the sun. But the Chockos turned out to be extraordinary soldiers, and they stopped the Japanese advance for the first time since the beginning of the First World War. This is the great military, fascist, Japanese imperial forces that are swept down through Malaya, that have captured Singapore, Britain's biggest port in the southern hemisphere, that have captured Indonesia, that were bombing North Australia, that were about to cross New Guinea. And the Chockos stopped them in their tracks. So in many regards, if you're looking at an example of a war where soldiers protected us, the Second World War and the campaign in New Guinea is the one that we should be really honouring and remembering, because this was an exercise against stopping fascist forces from invading this country. On ANZAC Day, we shouldn't actually be looking at what happened in World War I. We should remember the dead. We should be actually concentrating on what happened in New Guinea during World War II. And it's quite extraordinary that on ANZAC Day there'll be a cursory mention made of those campaigns, a cursory mention made of the Chockos, a cursory mention made of their sacrifice. Now, all wars after World War II, the Malay Emergency, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, those three wars were basically wars of invasion, where we basically bought our coalition with the United States in blood. We paid for it in blood, fighting other people's wars in other people's lands. And that's been the history of the Australian military up till 2019, the Iraq War, fighting other people's wars in other people's lands. So on ANZAC Day, I have mixed feelings. I have reservations about the way ANZAC Day is used to promote militarism and nationalism, because I think this is a stain on the character and the sacrifice of those men and women who have died in war on behalf of this country. On ANZAC Day, I actually think of the frontier wars that occurred when we colonised this country in the most brutal fashion. Not that I recommend that the Indigenous freedom fighters who died during that period, that 100-year period, be recognised on ANZAC Day. I recommend that they would be recognised on the 20th of January, the day that Tanaminewa and Maulboyheenner were hung in Melbourne in 1842 for resisting white colonisation. So I think these are two different issues. One is the frontier wars, wars which were fought by Aboriginal people and Torres Islanders to defend their way of life, their families, their lands, their culture. The wars that we've been involved in, apart from the Second World War, were basically wars of conquest where we fought on behalf of other nations, where we fought other people's wars. So it's a day of reflection. It's not a day to be angry. It's a day to reflect. It's a day to bring reality back to the discussion. It's not a day of blind faith. It's not a day of devotion. It's a day to look, reflect, examine, and try to understand why so many people have died for such little return to the community. I mean, we can say all wars are futile. Eventually all wars are futile. Look at the Vietnamese War. 3 million Vietnamese died, over 560 Australians, many conscripts died. Today the Vietnamese are one of our major tourist destinations. Look at the Chinese and the Korean War. Think of the old yellow hordes and the yellow peril that was going to invade Australia. Who's our biggest trading partner? China. So in many regards, all wars are futile. Look at our relationship with Japan today. But wars don't occur of their own accord. They occur because nation states are captured by ideologues and ideologies which promote nationalism and militarism as the core. Look at the Nazi regime in Germany, the fascist regime in Italy, the Phalangist in Spain, the Japanese imperial forces in Japan. What they did is create a society where militarisation became the norm, where to expand your empire you needed to conquer and subjugate other people. And in these types of wars you need to be able to convince the population to support you. I can't imagine in 2019 that people with the knowledge they have would actually fall for the same traps as our fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandparents fell for, where they were willing to die for a piece of paper or a flag or an ideology. Because life is much more than that. It's about a social contract that we have with each other, where we live and allow to live. It's not about categorising people by their nationality. It's not about categorising people by their race. It's about creating that world where war would be difficult to be waged. Today, with the mechanisation of war and the industrialisation of war, you no longer need foot soldiers. All you need is, planes and drones to conduct a war. But we now have the capacity to stop wars. And on ANZAC Day, I think what we should be thinking about is not about what a great nation state we are. We carved our name in history with the blood of our ancestors, but that we have now reached a point in human civilization where we can no longer be duped as a people into going to war to conquer other people, to steal their assets, to destroy their way of life. And about the only justification there is for war is in terms of national self-defence. And I'm not talking about forward defence, but national self-defence. Think about it. ANZAC Day will come and go. I'll go, you'll die, it'll continue. But think about it. Think about what you're going to tell your children. Think about the futility of war. Look after yourself. We'll see you next week, and hopefully the topic will be a little bit less sombre. That's why we're next to the blue stone. Sombre stone.